Shaquille O'Neal, NBA legend and cultural icon, had just moved into one of Los Angeles's most exclusive gated communities. His sprawling estate, complete with a private basketball court, infinity pool, and state-of-the-art gym, quickly became the talk of the neighborhood. While some neighbors were thrilled to share their community with such a global superstar, others weren't as welcoming. Their disapproval wasn't voiced outright but came in subtle, silent ways. It all started with a series of seemingly petty complaints, about the brightness of his outdoor lights, the sound of basketballs on his court, and even the height of his lawn. On the surface, it seemed like ordinary HOA enforcement. But as the complaints piled up, it became clear this wasn't about rules, it was about something much deeper. What Shaq did next not only confronted the bias head-on but left the entire community stunned. Oak Ridge Estates was the epitome of luxury living. The gated community, nestled in the heart of Los Angeles, was renowned for its manicured lawns, tree-lined streets, and homes that looked more like boutique hotels than residences. Each property boasted marble driveways, towering gates, and sprawling estates that reflected the exclusivity of the neighborhood. Silence reigned supreme here, broken only by the occasional hum of a luxury car gliding through or the soft chirping of birds in the perfectly pruned gardens. It was in this haven of wealth and refinement that Shaquille O'Neal purchased his dream home, a grand 15,000-square-foot mansion that could only be described as breathtaking. The estate featured a private basketball court, an infinity pool overlooking the city skyline, and a state-of-the-art gym fit for an NBA legend. For many, Shaq's arrival was a source of excitement. Fans among the neighbors whispered about their good fortune to live next door to a global superstar. But not everyone shared the sentiment. Some residents viewed Shaq's presence as a disruption, a break in the unspoken codes of exclusivity that the neighborhood had long upheld. His towering stature, vibrant personality, and celebrity status felt out of place to those who preferred to keep their community under a veil of uniformity and tradition. The divide was clear. While some saw Shaq as a source of pride for Oak Ridge Estates, others quietly plotted ways to send the message, "You don't belong here." It started with a simple letter, delivered to Shaquille O'Neal's sprawling estate on a sunny Monday morning. The envelope, neatly addressed to Mr. Shaquille O'Neal, came from the Oak Ridge Estates Homeowners Association. Inside, the tone was polite but firm. "Dear Mr. O'Neal, it has come to our attention that the outdoor lighting on your property exceeds the brightness levels permitted by the Oak Ridge Estates guidelines. Kindly adjust the lighting within 7 days to comply with community standards." Shaq chuckled as he read the note. "They're complaining about my lights," he asked his property manager. His wife, standing nearby, gave him a knowing look. "You know how these neighborhoods are. People love their rules." Shaq shrugged. It didn't seem like a big deal. He asked his property manager to dim the lights slightly and thought that would be the end of it. But it wasn't. A week later, another letter arrived. This time, it was about the grass on his front lawn. "Your lawn has uneven patches of grass. Please address this to maintain the neighborhood's aesthetic standards." Shaq raised an eyebrow but complied again, instructing his landscaping team to touch up the lawn. Soon, the complaints became more frequent, and more ridiculous. The sound of basketballs bouncing on his outdoor court was labeled as disruptive. His security team's SUVs were described as not in compliance with the neighborhood's aesthetic guidelines. Each letter felt more nitpicky than the last, as if someone was actively looking for reasons to criticize him. One evening, as Shaq sat in his study flipping through a stack of these letters, his frustration was palpable. His wife joined him, placing a cup of tea on his desk. "Another one?" she asked, glancing at the stack. "3 more," Shaq said, shaking his head. He held up the most recent letter. "This one's about the height of our hedges." "Seriously, hedges?" His wife sighed, sitting across from him. "Shaq, this feels personal," she said thoughtfully. "It's not about grass or lights. It's about us." Shaq nodded slowly. The complaints weren't just nitpicking, they were sending a message. One he couldn't ignore anymore. Shaquille O'Neal wasn't one to let things slide without understanding the bigger picture. After weeks of receiving increasingly petty complaints, he decided it was time to dig deeper. Curious about the sudden string of grievances, Shaq began speaking with his neighbors during casual encounters, on walks with his dog or while picking up mail. Most seemed friendly enough, but a few hinted at a deeper issue behind the complaints. One afternoon, a neighbor he had come to know well, an older man named Mr. Carter, leaned in during a conversation and lowered his voice. "Shaq, I probably shouldn't be telling you this, but you should know there's been some talk about you at the HOA meetings. Harold Whitman's been bringing you up a lot." Shaq raised an eyebrow. "Harold Whitman? Who's that?" Carter sighed. "He's been head of the HOA for years. Retired attorney, real old school type. He's always talking about preserving the culture of the neighborhood. And by that, he means keeping things the way they've always been." "Always been?" Shaq repeated, catching the unspoken meaning. "You know what I mean," Carter said, his voice apologetic. "It's all very coded, but he's been saying things about how your lifestyle might not fit the neighborhood. He's the one pushing the complaints. He's even convinced a few others on the board to go along with him." Shaq took a deep breath, the weight of Carter's words sinking in. This wasn't about bright lights, grass height, or basketball noise. This was about Harold Whitman's perception of who should and shouldn't live in Oak Ridge Estates. "Thanks for letting me know," Shaq said, shaking Carter's hand firmly. "You don't owe me thanks," Carter replied. "You belong here just like anyone else. I'm sorry you're dealing with this." That evening, Shaq sat down with his wife and explained what he'd learned. "It's not about the rules," he said quietly. "It's about who I am. They don't think I belong here." His wife nodded, her expression a mix of frustration and sadness. "So, what are you going to do?" Shaq leaned back, a determined look crossing his face. "I'm going to show them I'm not going anywhere. And I'm going to make them say it out loud." The Oak Ridge Estates Community Center was unusually crowded that evening. Word had spread quickly that Shaquille O'Neal, NBA legend and the neighborhood's newest, and most talked about, resident, would be attending the HOA meeting. Residents who rarely showed up had come out of curiosity, their murmurs filling the room. Some came to support Shaq, while others came to see how the conflict would unfold. At the front of the room stood Harold Whitman, the head of the HOA, his stern expression framed by wire-rimmed glasses. He called the meeting to order with his usual authoritative tone. "Good evening, everyone. We have several items on the agenda tonight, including..." "I'd like to speak first," Shaq's deep voice cut through the room. Whitman frowned. "This isn't the time for..." "I think it is," Shaq said firmly, standing up and stepping toward the front of the room. The room fell silent as every eye turned to him. At 7 feet 1 inch, Shaq's presence alone commanded attention, but tonight, it was his calm determination that held the room in suspense. Shaq took a moment to look around, meeting the eyes of his neighbors. Then he began. "In the past month, I've received more complaint letters than I ever got fan mail in my rookie year," he said, eliciting a few chuckles from the crowd. "But what's been happening here isn't funny. It's not about lights or lawns. It's about something deeper." He held up one of the letters for everyone to see. "When you send me this, what you're really saying is, you don't belong here. And let's be honest, we all know why." The room was still, save for the subtle shuffling of uncomfortable neighbors. Harold Whitman's face darkened, but he remained silent. "This community talks a lot about standards and culture," Shaq continued. "But whose standards? Whose culture? Because from where I'm standing, it looks like those words are being used to exclude." Whitman finally spoke, his voice tight. "Mr. O'Neal, these rules are in place for everyone. This isn't about you personally. Shaq turned to him, his gaze steady and unwavering. If these rules apply to everyone, why are they being enforced so aggressively now? Why wasn't the last owner of my house getting letters about the brightness of their lights or the height of their hedges? A younger resident, Emily Vasquez, stood up, her voice clear and confident. He's right. I've lived here for 5 years, and I've never seen this level of enforcement before. Another neighbor chimed in. LeBron's presence has put this neighborhood on the map. My kids are thrilled to have him here. Why are we pushing him away? Whitman raised his hand, trying to regain control. This is about maintaining the character of the neighborhood. Shaq stepped closer, his voice growing sharper. What character is that, Mr. Whitman? One that doesn't include people like me? The room buzzed with whispers and murmurs. Whitman, visibly flustered, tried to respond, but Shaq didn't let up. You talk about preserving culture and standards, but what you're really doing is hiding behind coded language to exclude people who don't fit your idea of what this community should look like. Well, guess what, I'm not going anywhere. I'm part of this community now, whether you like it or not. By now, more residents had begun to speak up. Shaq's right. These rules are being used unfairly, one said. This isn't the kind of neighborhood I want to live in if it's built on exclusion, added another. Whitman's grip on the meeting was slipping, and he knew it. His attempts to deflect were met with increasing resistance from the residents, many of whom had grown tired of his heavy-handed approach. As the meeting drew to a close, it was clear that Shaq's words had struck a chord. The room buzzed with conversation about fairness, bias, and what kind of community Oak Ridge Estates wanted to be. By the end of the evening, Whitman looked like a man defeated, his authority undercut by the very people he claimed to represent. The residents didn't leave that night with all the answers, but they left with a new perspective. And for the first time in weeks, Shaq felt like his voice had been heard. The fallout from the HOA meeting was immediate and widespread. Word of Shaquille O'Neal's powerful speech and the confrontation with Harold Whitman spread quickly throughout Oak Ridge Estates. Neighbors who had remained silent until now found themselves questioning the fairness of the HOA's practices. Conversations about bias and inclusivity began springing up in casual chats at the local park, in front yards, and even in the community's private online forum. For many, Shaq's words were a wake-up call. Residents who had previously turned a blind eye to the HOA's practices started to see the pattern of targeted complaints for what it was, an effort to exclude someone based on prejudice rather than legitimate concerns. Parents, in particular, began speaking out, sharing how their children admired Shaq not just as a basketball legend but as a role model. If this is how we treat someone like him, what kind of message are we sending to our kids? One neighbor wrote in an open letter to the community. Under mounting pressure from the residents, Harold Whitman quietly submitted his resignation as head of the HOA. The resignation letter, which cited personal reasons, did little to quell the growing discussions about the damage caused by his leadership. For many, Whitman's departure was the first step in healing the divide within the community. In response to the controversy, the HOA announced that it would conduct a comprehensive review of its policies. A committee was formed, consisting of a diverse group of residents, to ensure that the rules were being applied fairly and without bias. The HOA also pledged to implement new guidelines that would prevent targeted complaints and encourage transparency in the enforcement process. For Shaq, the change wasn't about seeking personal vindication, it was about making Oak Ridge Estates a better, more inclusive place for everyone. This isn't just about me, he told a reporter. It's about creating a community where everyone feels like they belong. The discussion sparked by Shaq's confrontation didn't stop at Oak Ridge Estates. Neighboring communities began to take note, initiating their own reviews of HOA policies to prevent similar incidents. What started as a series of petty complaints had turned into a movement for change, with Shaquille O'Neal leading the charge. A week after the contentious HOA meeting, Shaquille O'Neal decided to extend an olive branch to his neighbors. Instead of letting the tension linger, he hosted an open house at his sprawling estate, inviting every resident of Oak Ridge Estates to come together for a day of connection and community. The invitation promised a property tour, basketball on his private court, and an evening barbecue by the infinity pool. On the day of the event, Shaq's home buzzed with excitement. Children raced to the basketball court, thrilled at the chance to shoot hoops with the NBA legend. Parents snapped photos as Shaq lifted their kids for slam dunks, his booming laughter echoing across the property. Neighbors who had never spoken to one another mingled freely, sharing drinks and stories while exploring Shaq's home gym and breathtaking views of the Pacific Ocean. By the time the barbecue was in full swing, the atmosphere had shifted entirely. The laughter, clinking glasses, and smell of grilled food created a sense of warmth that had been missing in the community. Shaq took a moment to gather everyone near the pool, standing tall but relaxed, a plate of ribs in one hand and a mic in the other. "Let me say this," he began, his deep voice cutting through the chatter. "This isn't about me proving I belong here. It's about creating a space where everyone belongs. A space where your kids can grow up dreaming big, and where no one has to feel like they don't fit in." Applause rippled through the crowd. His words resonated not just because of who he was, but because they spoke to the heart of what the neighborhood could be, a true community, built on inclusivity and respect. The evening ended with a fireworks display that lit up the sky, symbolizing a fresh start for Oak Ridge Estates. What began as a confrontation had turned into an opportunity for unity, and Shaq had shown that real strength isn't just physical, it's in building bridges where others might build walls. Over the following months, the community began to change in subtle but meaningful ways. Residents held more open discussions about inclusivity and fairness, recognizing the importance of fostering a welcoming environment for everyone. The HOA, under its new leadership, implemented policies designed to prevent bias and ensure that every resident was treated equally. Shaq became more than a neighbor, he became a cornerstone of the community. He continued hosting occasional neighborhood events, using his home as a space where people could connect and share ideas. Children admired him not only as a basketball legend but as someone who stood up for what was right. In an interview with a prominent news outlet, Shaq reflected on the experience. "Change takes courage," he said, his tone thoughtful but firm. "It's not easy, but it's always worth it. Whether it's on the court or in your own backyard, you've got to stand up for what's right." The reporter asked if he ever felt the need to prove himself to the community. Shaq shook his head with a smile. "I'm not here to prove anything. I'm here to make things better, for everyone." As the story of Shaq's impact on Oak Ridge Estates spread, it became an example of how one voice, used courageously, could spark transformation. Shaquille O'Neal didn't just defend his home, he transformed his neighborhood, leaving behind a legacy of unity, fairness, and inclusivity that would last for generations.